Welcome to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, where we sit down with the people who give shape, texture, and voice to life on the North Fork of Long Island. Some are rooted here by generations, others arrived by chance or choice, but all carry with them a piece of the story. We talk about what's changing, what's worth holding on to, and the currents of history, both quiet and loud, that run through this place. I'm your host, Christopher Bianchi, and for episode 176, we sit down with Nicholas Planamento, a Southold resident and community member who has served on the Zoning Board of Appeals, Planning Commission, and several other local committees. His experience in real estate has given him a close view of Southold's housing needs and the changes shaping the North Fork. Over the years, he's worked on a range of local issues from planning and preservation to supporting balanced growth across the town. As candidate for Southold Town Council, Nicholas is focused on housing, water quality, preservation, and thoughtful development. In our conversation, we talk about his background, his involvement in local boards, and his ideas for addressing the challenges and opportunities ahead for the town. So I hope you enjoy episode 176 with Nicholas Planamento. This episode was recorded September 9th, 2025. Thank you so much for coming on the Floyd Memorial Library podcast today. It's really great to have you on today.
Chris, thank you. This is a wonderful opportunity that you're offering me. I think I mentioned in our meeting that I've never done a podcast before, so please bear with me. This is kind of an exciting new opportunity. Thank you.
Definitely. And as with many of the other episodes, I usually like to start off with if you can give us a little introduction about yourself, your background.
Excellent. So my name is Nicholas Planamento. I live here in Southold, but I was raised in northern Westchester in a town called Yorktown. I was always aware of Eastern Long Island. We have, my mother's family has relatives, different cousins, people that live on Eastern Long Island. I never really understood the connection to Eastern Long Island other than through one cousin of mine who lived or was really sort of raised straddling the Riverhead Southold town line. And starting in the mid-1990s, she was really sort of pushed or lobbied for me to relocate to Southold. I couldn't really figure out how to be here. I'd always enjoyed Southold, but just didn't even think about how I could take my career, what I was doing, and relocate. And at the time, I had a rather large business with my husband, a business called Mediterranean Living, and we imported home furnishings from Morocco, from Peru, from Italy, and from the south of France that we would trade wholesale, or had a wholesale business that we delivered throughout the country. And while I had a prior experience sort of with Eastern Long Island, as I said, through my family, we had at the time a very large business based in Port Chester, New York. And as the result of an eminent domain issue, which probably took a little over 2 years to clarify before we kindly, be released and were able to relocate, that was really the time that we made the decision to move here in the mid-1990s.
Yes. No, but just to go back a bit, could you talk about what your parents did for a living?
Yeah, so I was raised in Yorktown, New York by a stay-at-home mother. My father was is a retired fireman. They really were the most amazing parents. Sadly, my mom died a little over, at this point, 20 years ago. My dad is now, he'll be 92 in October. Thank God he's a wonderfully healthy guy, plays tennis every day. But I had the most amazing parents, and I would actually argue that I was sort of raised more by my grandmother, who had a major influence on me, and that would be my father's mother. My father's parents actually came from Italy. My father was born here shortly after his arrival their arrival in the United States. He was the sixth child, and he has 4 other siblings. So he came from a rather large family, so I always had people, commotion, excitement around the house. But most of my relatives were all involved in some form or another of something maybe entrepreneurial or relative to public service.
Mm-hmm. And could you talk about just your time growing up in Yorktown?
Yeah, so
as a child.
Yorktown was a truly special place. It's a suburban community, I would argue, something I reflect upon a lot just because of all the changes that happened during my lifetime. I have publicly said this about my time here in Southold, that I don't want to see Southold destroyed or lost. The identity of Yorktown changed drastically in the 1970s. There was a huge urban renewal program where the entire downtown, which dated well over 200 years, or dated back well over 200 years, was literally razed overnight, and shopping centers and sort of strip malls were built. So anyone that's familiar with Yorktown today doesn't really know what Yorktown looked like in the 1940s, the 1950s, the 1960s. And while I didn't grow up in Yorktown at that time, I had a strong appreciation for it, just knowing the people, knowing the community as I remembered it as a small child, witnessing all the development and places that you'd play. Additionally, Yorktown was really a special place because there were large farms. It was a huge dairy community. I grew up just above Hilltop Hanover Farm, which was owned by the Crystal family for well over 200 years. And it was just a beautiful experience to, have the opportunity to grow up and play in open space, not all that dissimilar to Southold. I would argue that Southold, of course, has the water, the added benefit of the water, which is something that makes it even more special. But, it's dear to my heart to ensure that Southold really remains the special and wonderful place that it is.
Mm-hmm. And also, just coming out of school there, did you know what you wanted to do coming out of high school?
Wow, that's an interesting conversation or question. Growing up, and I think partially because of my dad and my grandparents' experiences, I always wanted to do something more international. I actually always thought I would end up working in the Foreign Service. For a while after I'd gone to college and grad school, and I was very dissatisfied with my life, I was working in human resources in the city. I was really not happy. I decided to study architecture, which is something I really appreciate and always valued. I couldn't figure out how to get to that point, but meeting someone, at an event or something, I forget what the story was, I offered to drive this woman back to her home in Brooklyn. However, I was driving back to Westchester at the time. And she said, if you had all the money in the world, what would you do? I said, oh, what do you mean? She said, no, I mean, after you go out and you buy everything that you want, what would you do? I said, oh, that's easy. I would study architecture. So she said, well, why don't you? And out of that, I thought about a friend of mine that actually put himself through school studying at the City College of New York, their School of Architecture and Engineering. And I said, my gosh, why wouldn't I do it? So, of course, I enrolled. I made it halfway through the program. And unfortunately, my life took a different change in that I met my spouse, my partner. We sort of embarked upon a different career. And I mentioned a little bit earlier that I had a business, Mediterranean Living, where we imported home furnishings and other things. That took a solid 6 months out of the year out of my life, which sort of precluded me from ultimately graduating in the master's program at the City College of New York. But yeah, no, I'm pretty happy. All the different experiences I've had in my life actually bring me to your table today. Yes. And I can't say I'd want to change anything about my past. It's phenomenal.
Yes. And then we might be jumping a bit, but could you talk about when you first discovered the North Fork?
So, the community was sort of always in the forefront of my mind. It's something I grew up with. As I said earlier, my mom has a cousin. It's technically my second cousin that she and her family had a very large horse farm in Riverhead. They owned properties in Mattituck and in Southold Town. And it was something I always grew up with. It's a place that I always enjoyed visiting. It's a beautiful community. I mean, sadly, what I remember from being a 9-year-old versus, a 58-year-old is incredibly different. But, the pungent smell of cauliflower and the endless acres of potatoes is sort of a thing of distant memory. But it was a community that it was something that I was aware of, but I wasn't in a position, certainly as a child, to make a determination to move here. It wasn't until later in life that I came to Southold.
And could you talk about that decision to move out here?
So I mentioned my 92-year-old father, and I think he would still lobby for me to have moved to Florida. At the time, he had a house in Naples, Florida. He had found multiple properties that we could relocate our warehouse business to in Naples, Florida. I just couldn't envision how you could get a 40-foot container delivered from Europe or North Africa, or even the merchandise that we'd import from South America, to Naples. It just seemed like an incredibly complicated task, landing at the port of Miami, shipping it across Florida, etc. Whereas whenever I'd reflect upon the North Fork and Southold Town, I saw an incredible place that I always wanted to live in. I saw a family connection. I saw incredible things that just sparked my imagination. And of course, the Port of New York and New Jersey is, 90 miles away. So there wouldn't have been that much of a change in our business or our life. So it made it really easy to make that commitment. The difficult part was, of course, trying to find a property which would allow us to use it the way that we wanted to. At the time, while the North Fork or Southold had vineyards, they were few and far between. It wasn't the community that you see today. There were a lot of old farmhouses, big open spaces, a lot of abandoned homes. And it was just, in my mind's eye, the way that I looked at it a lot, a bit like the Wild West, that you could almost make your own mark. There was a whole new frontier and opportunity where the community was really excited to have new people move in and very welcoming. The difficulty, of course, is to find an agriculturally useful property that's also zoned commercial, which would have allowed us to build a small winery or something. We had a discussion. As I mentioned, my spouse is Dutch, and he always appreciated champagne. And one of the things that we thought about doing was, in relocating our business to the North Fork, to Southold, we could buy a large sort of farm property and over the years plant it and begin production for a varietal that would allow us to produce some sort of a champagne-style New York State sparkling wine. And all the while, we'd still be traveling and dealing with our wholesale trade show network, dealing with sourcing different products abroad and importing. So it would have been this really wonderful mix of activity, but the difficulty was finding a property that actually had that zoning. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, Southold, every property we looked at just would not conform to what our needs were. We had a great team among a local real estate agent, a local attorney. There is one property which today is being developed as the Enclaves Hotel that we had looked at. There was an adjacent property right there also, which we didn't pursue. It's probably one of the oldest homes in Southold also, but we ended up relocating to Riverhead because Riverhead actually welcomed us. And they said, well, look, we don't care what the zone is. Storage is storage. So whether you're storing potatoes or storing wholesale merchandise, we welcome you. Okay. So we had actually relocated our business to Riverhead.
And you're still operating that business?
No, sadly, September 11th threw a wrench in our plans. We had a large number of employees. We had permanent showrooms in New York, in Atlanta, in Dallas, in San Francisco. We'd be traveling a substantial amount of time of the year. We had large orders. We had, technically, I would argue it was a small business, even though it was really quite large. And just having the port shut down and the different changes as far as importing goods and containers really set us back, and financially it was impossible to keep the business running. So unfortunately, the business ended. I reflected upon not only my education, but my prior career. When I was 18, I got a real estate license. A family friend had suggested I should become a real estate agent. He just saw the enthusiasm, the excitement when you talk about architecture, the community that I lived in. And as a result of having my real estate license from when I was 18, I think the maturity that I brought as an older individual and as a homeowner opened my eyes to the possibility of selling real estate. So at that point, I embarked upon a career locally as a real estate professional.
Mm-hmm. And now getting up to today, before running for office, you've been deeply involved in community boards. And what motivated you to get involved in the community?
Everywhere I've lived, I've always been involved in the community. I think that it's an important component to be a contributing member of your community. Mm-hmm. I suppose when you're in New York City, it must be a large urban center. It must be a really difficult sort of task to sort of find a way to make your mark or to actually help people. But in a small town, your voice is clearly heard. We had a shop on Love Lane as a result of having that business in the 2000 period just before September 11th. And for about 9 years after, I got to know a lot of people in our community. I love history. There's a multitude of books, both locally and sort of even internationally, that sort of remind you of the places that you live in the sense of, I'm thinking of Russell Shorto's The Island at the Center of the World, which really discusses the formation of what makes New York a different community versus Boston or Wilmington. Mm-hmm. locally, and I had a lot of free time also when I was sitting in the store on Love Lane. I mean, honestly, the level of tourism was a fraction of what we have in town today. But as a result of that and the friendships that I embarked upon with a variety of different people, merchants, local people, attorneys, vineyard owners, you name it, discussing things like this book, or I'm seeing over your shoulder, there's, Heaven and Earth, which I believe is Steve Wick's book, on the shelf behind you. Reverend Whitaker's History of Southold, or I'm losing track of the name of the gentleman, the pastor in Mattituck, who was a Presbyterian that wrote the History of Mattituck. But the point being that, just learning about the community, discussing these things sort of in an open forum, oftentimes New England style. I believe the phrase is called gamming, among old fishermen sitting at, the general store by the potbelly stove. These conversations came to a forefront, and my voice, my enthusiasm for Love Lane, which was quite honestly a very quiet place. Stores had been, shortly before I arrived, truly vacant. The needs of the community had really shifted with the aging of Southold, that a lot of people had left, young people, and there was sort of this void. And as a result of that and the different friendships that I embarked upon and the involvement in town government, serving on different committees, I was able to really forge my own path within the town, which I do hope that over the last 25 years, I've been helpful to the people of
Yes.
Southold.
Yes. And that's led you to run for Southold Town Board. What motivated you to run in the race today?
So quite honestly, and I suppose some people within the Republican Party might not be happy by me saying, I literally refused their request 3 times. I kept saying, no, no, no. And not because it's something that I don't appreciate, and I'm certainly flattered. And of course, I finally yielded. But my life is rather full. I enjoy the things I do. I love my community. I serve as the vice chair of the town's zoning board of appeals. Previous to that, I was the Southold appointed member to the Suffolk County Planning Commission. And I had a variety of different volunteer roles. And, I just really thought that when you're running for town office, it's not only a big commitment, but there should be stature. And I could think of many people that I know and respect in our town that I would think should run. Well, at the end of the day, they weren't running. And it really dawned on me. I said, you know what? I think I have something I can offer the people of Southold. I honestly believe that I'm a committed resident, that I'm knowledgeable of our community, and that I really can offer the people of Southold guidance, and to serve them would be a huge honor. Mm-hmm. And I'm delighted, as I said when I first sat down, to be sitting here talking with you about this, because I do think that my experiences, and I have many, I'm not doubting that other people or other candidates don't have similar broad experiences, but I do think that I'm unique amongst my peers, and I'm delighted to be running for this office.
Yes. And now you're working as a real estate agent. How has your work as a real estate agent shaped your understanding of Southold's housing challenges and opportunities?
I think, first of all, as a real estate professional, you have to wear many hats. Mm-hmm. If you're an accountant, and I'm not suggesting that accountants don't have to do other things, it's pretty specific. Mm-hmm. Or if you're a bookkeeper. As a real estate professional, you have to have so many different hats, so many different hands in the fire as far as things that you do to help people achieve their investment goals, whether they're buying or selling a home. As a result of that, and I think my involvement as a real estate professional, getting to know people, helping them with their individual investments, both, as I said, buying and selling, I'm acutely aware of where the market is and how that impacts members of the community and their aspirations and dreams of owning and staying in the community that perhaps they grew up in. We have a history nearly of 400 years of life on the North Fork. I believe we just celebrated our 375th. So what would our anniversary be right now? Probably around 378 years or something to that degree. Mm-hmm. Probably a little bit more. But the idea being that you've got so many families locally. I mean, these are the people I mentioned that first engaged me, that I have great friendship with and huge respect for, but multi-generational people that had whatever heritage and history here, whether they were originally farmers or whatever career development occurred during their families' experiences, People want to remain in the same town. And it's something that I really think is harder and harder every day for a young person that graduates, whether it's from Greenport or Mattituck or Southold High School, to maybe obtain home ownership. And as a real estate professional, I really have sympathy, I think, for people. I get calls all the time where people are looking for rentals, where they're not even thinking about purchasing because they don't have the means, but they want to save money. And it's a problem. I don't know if we have an answer. I don't know if anyone will have an answer as far as what affordable housing is, but it's something that certainly I'd like to work on and hopefully help guide people.
Yes. And you've mentioned you've served on the Zoning Board of Appeals and the Planning Commission and other committees. Could you talk about what lessons you've learned from those roles?
I think the word that comes to mind, which is in itself a lesson, is patience. Working in private industry, certainly as a real estate agent, I'm sort of in control of my daily life. However, whether it was serving on the Architectural Review Committee, helping plan Southold's 375th anniversary, the zoning board, it's a very different energy because you're before the public. You have to work with people of all different walks of life, all different needs, all different financial backgrounds, aspirations, you name it. And you really have to listen patiently to what people are looking for. Specifically on the Zoning Board of Appeals, we're tasked with offering people relief from a zoning code. Oftentimes, there's, I don't want to call it a combat, but between what people's aspirations or dreams are different perhaps than what the law actually allows. So I think, listening to people, trying to, and as a zoning board, we don't have the opportunity to really mediate, but from various other committees, the opportunity to sort of build consensus and hopefully move something forward where everybody's equitable and happy is a good thing. But I think patience is probably the most important thing I've learned from my years of volunteering.
It can be a slow process of moving things along too, probably with meetings and just working.
I would say absolutely working government. You have to remember that depending on whether it's at the Suffolk County level or here in town, depending on what the project is or what it might entail, sort of from inspiration to completion, there's so many different steps along the way. And you have to remember, depending on what it is that somebody hopes to achieve, so many different departments to deal with. Zoning is just one for my role as on the Zoning Board of Appeals, but you've got the trustees, you've got the building department, you've got New York State Building Code, you have public opinion, public hearings. But I think the best thing is just allowing people to talk, to voice their concerns, to listen, and to sort of disseminate, to distill what that person has said in order to make a decision.
Yes. And obviously, even since moving out here, Southold has continued to change, and it does have a deep history, like you mentioned, but there is growing pressure for development. How do you balance preservation with the need for sensible development?
So I think first the key word there is preservation. I think almost anyone that lives in town wants to see our community preserved. I believe prior town boards have made huge strides in preserving open space and the community character. This is what makes Southold so special that people want to be here. I would argue that Route 58, the corridor in Riverhead, is infinitely less appealing than County Road 48 in Southold.
Yes.
While there is pressure for development, I think if the correct zoning is put into place, we can actually steer where development occurs. I don't want to say when, but we can control that we don't have that sort of development. And honestly, the prior boards have done incredible things to keep Southold what Southold is. As a child growing up, I witnessed that sort of rampant development, and looking at my community and the reasons why I moved here, I loved the fact that it felt like it was a distant place from New York. We were in the shadow of New York, but your daily experience, the vistas that you saw, were of another time. And it's heartbreaking for me over the last 25 years, and even going back earlier as a child, seeing barns fall, seeing old houses abandoned, being razed, buildings substantially altered. I don't want to sound like too much of a romanticist, but earlier today when I first met you, we were talking about Whitney Hubbard. He captured in his own sort of impressionistic way as a local artist working on the North Fork and in Connecticut and other places. I was surprised to learn he went to Florida. That was something I was unaware of. But, you can't turn the clock back. So I think that, we talked a little bit about traffic. We talked a little bit about tourism. I think that if we put the right controls in place, and also recognizing that we are a tourist economy, is helpful to guide us in the future as far as how we can preserve Southold, to keep what we have, and to really enhance it so that future generations also will have that same opportunity and experience that I've had and, other residents enjoy.
Yes. But just thinking of, actually, I'll hold that question for later, but because I wanted to get back to housing a bit. We talked about it a bit, but what specific steps would you like to see the town take to support young people, families, and seniors who want to stay out here?
Housing is really probably among the most difficult topics. It's a hotbed for everyone in town. I don't know, whether you speak about community housing, affordable housing. There's so many points because based upon the individual's experience, there's a different expectation. And what is affordable? I think the idea is to have attainable housing. We have to look at other sources. Within Southold, most of our zoning only allows a single-family residential structure. That's prohibitively expensive to many people. And while there are opportunities for accessory dwelling units or apartments within a home, really, without expanding our hamlet centers and creating density where we can have more housing, it's a very difficult conversation because the zoning just doesn't allow it. In the hamlet centers, and that's not a zoning term, but we have like HB, you can have a 2-family house. There's limited opportunities, and I honestly think what we need to really do is to expand on those zones and perhaps really look at the hamlet centers, so the ring around a place like Mattituck or Southold, the main Route 25 center between the North Road and the main road, to expand uses that not only allow the ADUs that might already be achievable, but to look at alternative housing resources. I'm not personally a big fan of tiny houses, but I don't see why we can't have attached dwellings or even apartment buildings or townhouses. And I just think that we really need to have a dialogue that opens up the opportunity to have a very diverse and varied housing stock that might also allow for higher density, which maybe it also involves the town either acquiring the land so that it's actually more affordable and then the land or the building lot is actually leased to an individual, or maybe the town becomes the owner of the particular property that's developed. But I do think we need a diverse housing source that goes above and beyond a single-family residence or a small ADU or even an apartment over a storefront. I think we need to look at other varietal or other types of housing.
Yes. I think it can be a challenge with people talking about trying to preserve the open space and also not wanting sprawl within the town of Southold, because you could have, not to point out just the Vineyard View development, but
I don't know why they call it Vineyard View.
I'm not sure, but it's more isolated from the community, and
given that density, and there's not even sidewalks that lead you to or from, it's quite a busy road. As you kind of zip by, you can look down and you see they have this little fenced-in playpen area for the young children. Yeah, something like that should really be in a hamlet center sort of setting. I think in an effort to build out affordable housing, certain things maybe get forgotten or go by the wayside. But I honestly think that if we look at the infill of lots, as a real estate professional, I do happen to be more aware of people that want to sell. I would expect that maybe the land preservation coordinator in town hall is also aware of people that might be interested in selling development rights. But maybe it's time that the town should actually buy specific housing or lots in those areas so that a project like Vineyard View could be sited adjacent to public transportation, within walkable distance of shops and restaurants or other amenities that you'd expect, where it just makes it easier for everyone to enjoy.
Yes. And you can have more people within those developments.
The higher densities, absolutely. Density. I think under the proposed code changes, the highest number of residential units per acre will be 8. which is a step in the right direction. But I honestly do think that we need higher density in the hamlet centers. And, projects more like in Mattituck, which was something I participated in the early 2000s, the development of the cottages. I think they're brilliant, brilliant ideas to have individual homes so that the individual that takes the time to invest in purchasing a home actually has some sense of equity and appreciation. Maybe not a market rate appreciation, but they still benefit of that equity.
Yes.
And I think that makes it so much better than, I don't want to suggest not owning, but being an apartment dweller isn't a good thing. But I think in the end, you're only making the landlord wealthier.
Yes.
But, why not co-ops or some sort of condominiums, attached dwelling? I mean, there's so many different types of houses, but I think that we really need to, visit that opportunity to see what design fits where. And perhaps even within, there's property owned by the town of Southold between Youngs Avenue, Boise Avenue, and the North Road. I think it's about 27 acres. Perhaps it's sort of like a village within the village. So you could have a section which is more geared towards tiny homes or attached dwellings or an apartment style house or townhouses or even, independent homes. It's a large parcel and it's ideally sited for that walkability to all kinds of town resources.
And you think the ADU, those accessory dwelling units, do you think that's more of a Band-Aid and it doesn't really address the major issue facing the town?
As vice chairman of the town zoning board of appeals, I'm part of the decision team that grants the relief that allows a property owner an ADU. Prior to COVID, the town board was contemplating allowing ADUs, and an ADU is an accessory dwelling unit. So this is an apartment in a freestanding structure. By right, you can have, and there's a formula that you have to follow, but by right, you could build an apartment in your home. So if you have an attached garage, or if you want to convert your basement or whatever part of your actual residence to an apartment, you're allowed to do that by right. We're talking about the sort of freestanding structure. So if you have a garage or some sort of a barn or a shed in your backyard, that is the ADU. You need to be a full-time resident. Prior to COVID, I started to say the town board was contemplating allowing every property owner the right to have an ADU in their backyard. Of course, with COVID, things sort of shifted, and I don't think that the current town board is really entertaining that conversation. However, the ADUs, when we do grant them, and they're few and far between, it's not like many people are seeking them. I would hope that people would, but there's a lot of misunderstanding about them. And ultimately, a lot of people just don't like the idea of having a non-related person, not a family member, but a stranger potentially living so close to their own dwelling. And I don't think they're as favorable as they should be, but I do think that people really should take more of an effort to understand how an ADU can function and what the benefits are, along with the opportunity for affordable housing in Southold. I think they're great resources. And of course, those sort of structures are clearly tied, if they're not a family member that's leasing the space, tied to our affordable housing registry. Yes. And that's an opportunity for people, whether you're a policeman, a school teacher, a retiree, they're great resources.
And to switch topics a bit, water quality, farmland preservation, and open space remain top concerns. What role should the town board play in protecting these resources?
I think absolutely all need protection.
I
think we'll all agree as Southolders. The interesting conversation about water quality is a big one. Years ago, we did not have public water. Suffolk County Water Authority slowly moved east. Of course, when it got to the causeway in East Marion, things stopped. Orient people did not want water. They did not want development. I suppose they might have wanted the public water, but they really didn't want the potential of the development that came with it. Having said that, I would argue that there's questions about water quality. We just experienced over the last 2 months, maybe it's closer to 6 weeks, new town legislation limiting irrigation systems, where prior there were no town laws. You could water based upon your own schedule. The town board felt that this was a bit abusive and wasting a quality resource, that while the aquifer does absorb it, to get it back to the potable drinking water quality takes, decades. So bringing public water in, and there's, a discussion about getting a water main through Riverhead Town that sort of meets with resistance. It's sort of a bit of an oxymoron because in one level we're told that we don't have enough water, therefore you want to bring a new water main in to keep water pressure, etc. But then the other side of the coin, we're told that there's water problems. And thinking again about Orient, a lot of people have saltwater infiltration that could benefit of potentially that water main, or if there was a main brought across the causeway. I think at the end, it goes back to zoning, though, because if we put the legislation in place that limits the zoning, you wouldn't have that growth that people are afraid of by providing quality water. Mm-hmm. But it's something that needs more discussion.
Yes,
but I do wholeheartedly support, the environment. I love being out on my boat, sailing on the Peconic Bay. The waters here are the best in the world, in my opinion. The fishing is amazing. We really need to keep our beaches and our waterways clean and safe. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And do you worry about if there was new housing or people wanting to build to be right on the water, but then you worry about erosion and runoff from people's houses? Is that something that needs to be...
Well, you're talking about water level rise, the sea level rise, or you're talking about the environmental concerns of the sanitary system?
Yeah, environmental concerns.
I think, again, because I'm certainly concerned about our waterways, whether it's the bay, the sound, the creeks that feed to it, are natural, and we have a few kettle hole sort of ponds. A lot of people have man-made water features. Water is an important commodity for all of us. I don't think it's something that can be taken for granted or lightly. I do think that most homeowners have concern over their sanitary systems. I think any new residences built, and by the way, I made a decision, well over 25 years ago, the home that I purchased, I wanted an existing home. I didn't want to see the ground disturbed or a lot created. But the idea today that we have an innovative and an alternative wastewater treatment system, which is different than an old cesspool or a gravity-fed septic system, the water that discharges from the IA system is supposed to be of potable quality. So I think there are strides that are made, for the families that live on the water, whether it's on a beachfront location or a creekfront location. I do think they have a different responsibility. Mm-hmm. But we all know that if and when those individuals want to alter their home or do some sort of substantial work, this conversation comes up. And fortunately, we have a body, an elected group, the trustees, who help govern and mediate what a property owner might want to do with their property versus what needs to be done to ensure that the environment is protected.
Yes.
And these are wonderful people that both volunteer, and of course the staff is incredible too. Mm-hmm. But these are things that it's a different responsibility for a property owner that's on a waterfront location versus somebody, for example, in the middle of Southold, maybe up off of Route 48 or something. I mean, I think Route 48 is sort of the division. Water flows to the sound north of 48, whereas south of 48 it feeds into the bay. So pesticides, other things that may be, you don't necessarily think that, your non-waterfront parcel can't impact the environment. Well, it does because of pesticides or, whatever lawn chemicals people want to use to keep their beautiful lawns clean. Mm-hmm. Not clean, but green. I think as a society, we're more and more trained about these things. I'm not big on telling people what to do or creating laws and legislations that limit rights. But at some point, if people are not paying attention, we do have to stand up for the environment and to protect it. And actually, to that point, as quickly as the irrigation law went into effect, we've been talking about a tree law for over 10 years. And I don't understand, the first thing that people do oftentimes when they buy in the town of Southold is they clear cut their lots.
Yes.
Which only encourages planting grass, which means more fertilizer. And even if you're at that non-waterfront location, we know that everything ultimately feeds to either the bay or the sound.
Yes. And the fee probably is, they'll just probably figure they'll pay the fee, and that's...
When you say fee?
Like for if they cutting down a certain size tree or...
Oh, you're speaking about... So if somebody's on a monitored lot where it's within the trustee's jurisdiction, there are penalties and a fee if somebody takes a tree down.
Yes.
But as I understand our town code, if you're living in a regular lot that wherever it might be within the township of Southold, there is no tree law. There's no limitation to what you can or cannot do with your trees.
Or even
outside of the trustee's jurisdiction.
Okay.
There is, I believe, when you're building a new home, I believe town law provides for a maximum of 40% lot clearing for that construction. However, you have to remember most people, and I don't want to make the developer or the contractor, whoever is being used for the property clearing, but things happen. And unfortunately, we find ourselves where the landscape is denuded. I live on Hortons Lane, for example, and I purchased a house there because I loved the character, while most of Southold has a very open, flat landscape, short of being up on the bluff or at a waterfront location. Hortons Lane has a wonderful terrain. It's rocky outcroppings, and it's among the oldest streets or roads in the town of Southold. And the woodland really make it a special and beautiful place, unlike other parts of town or its own special character. And it's kind of sad to see the number of people taking trees down. And I can list all streets. I mean, I think among Southolders, there's a lot of concern about tree clearing. And of course, what does that mean for the impact on the environment?
Yes, definitely. And also, what are your thoughts on economic development, and how can the town support local businesses while keeping Southold's small town character intact?
I think I said this earlier. Southold as a community, we're nearly 400 years into this. There were a variety of different things that have occurred over our history, which is unique. But I think one of the more special things, starting probably close to 30 or 30 years ago, out of the croppings of the local Chamber of Commerce, working with the town, was the North Fork Promotion Council. I was involved with the North Fork Promotion Council for a number of years, and the North Fork Promotion Council basically was a group of all the local chambers of commerces, along working side by side with the town, much like today we have the Economic Development Commission. We had 2 functioning visitor booths, one in Greenport and one in Laurel, to welcome tourists. And every business in town was asked to participate, to leave, whether it was their business card or a pamphlet on the services that they offered, or something special about their business, whatever it might be, to help promote in a positive way the town of Southold. It's sort of a double-edged sword, because the reason why everyone sort of comes here is the specialness of the community, the sort of farm-to-table experience of our restaurants, the broad open fields, the maritime culture, the shellfish, the fishing. The list goes on and on and on. We live in the most special place. I'll again mention right over your shoulders a book by Steve Wick, Heaven and Earth. From an economical standpoint, I think that as a town, we need to recognize and embrace the fact that we're a tourist-based economy. We don't have the back offices that other communities have. We don't have business. We're not a suburban community that just services New York City. We're really an independent town, but a lot of people do come here specifically as tourists. And I think it's an important thing that we need to focus on, and that I don't want to say need to tame it, but we have the opportunity to control tourism. And I think out of tourism, there's a lot of money to be made. There's so many young people with incredible startup businesses in town. I mean, I don't want to suggest that the snail wrangler is 10 years old. I can't remember how long he's been around, but the idea that you could start a snail farm in Southold is something truly special. People have weaving businesses, art-based businesses, all kinds of creative things related to food and wine. And I think there's huge opportunities for people to make a lot of money while preserving our way of life and really enjoying themselves and being contributing members of Southold.
Mm-hmm. Do you think, but just even, you mentioned Love Lane, and that was when you moved there. I mean, when you had the business there, it was more empty, you would say, at that time, or?
In all fairness, and I love the Cardinale family, but at the time, Love Lane was sort of a very sleepy, quiet spot. I started selling little Love Lane hearts that a friend of mine in Morocco made for us. And a lot of people still in town, I see them have these wonderful little Love Lane hearts, which, there have been a variety of different vendors used as far as promoting Love Lane. But my thought was Love Lane is the heart of the North Fork. And along with 2 or 3 other merchants on Love Lane, we did all kinds of things to draw attention to Love Lane. At the time, the Chamber of Commerce, the focus really was on the Mattituck Shopping Center and the movie theater. And it was a very different, more suburban mindset than what I think people look at today. And I don't want to suggest that we're ahead of ourselves 25 years ago, but Love Lane is an incredibly rich resource. Just the concept of Love Lane, which as I understand it evolved from Lover's Lane, where courting couples would leave church, and the Presbyterian church dates from, I think, 1670. Mattituck, like all of the hamlets in Southold and most of the townships within Suffolk County, were designed, or I shouldn't say designed, but were created as the function of horse travel, that when you wanted to go from Brooklyn or New York to Boston, it was much easier to make 2 ferry crossings, both at the East River and on the Long Island Sound, than I believe it's 13 river crossings if you went from Manhattan through the Bronx, north into Connecticut, etc., to get to Boston. And as a result of, well, I shouldn't say as a result, but Love Lane started out really as a Indian portage for their canoes, so that you could travel from, like whether it was the Shinnecock Nation on the South Fork that wanted to get to the tribes in what we call Connecticut. That's the narrowest point. You could just, drop a canoe in the water, pick it up, carry it across to the James Creek, and then continue your paddle. So the whole idea about the development of Love Lane was just a really rich history from pre-Columbian times to more modern society. And I'm delighted that today people really respond to what Love Lane is. They really value it as the heart of the North Fork. It's a beautiful place. I think I got off topic.
No, but I wanted to ask, looking from the shops from even the 2000s into the 2010s and today, do you see some challenges with small businesses being able to afford to lease some of these spaces and seeing more chain places that can afford?
I think Town Code actually tries to limit any sort of chain/franchise sort of national brands. Interestingly, we have Allstate offices. We had actually a couple of Starbucks.
We had one here in Greenport.
Right. Well, Aldo shut that down.
Yes.
We love Aldo. I can't imagine a young person starting the sort of business that my partner and I started. And I think historically, when you go back, and I don't want to sound like an old person or a dinosaur, but I am 58. I've had different experiences. The world has changed. That I think it's almost impossible for young people to start businesses other than like the cottage industry that I was talking about earlier. And I don't want to say that Southold is Etsy, but Etsy as a brand or a website, you have it. It's just I think they call it a marketplace. So I can't imagine a young person being able to sign a lease. The days of a mom and pop business are pretty much gone, I think. And it's kind of sad because people with all kinds of creativity could do special things. Now, contrary to what I just said, I do think that from the farm to table experience, from a tourism standpoint, there's so many things that people can actually create in a home-based sort of business. I don't know to what degree the business can scale out. At some point, maybe you do need to move into that storefront or find real commercial space. But I think that it's very hard for a young person to start that type of business today. And I don't know if that's something that they want to do. I think that we live in such an electronic age. There's all kinds of other venues. So that just might actually open up the possibility for adaptive reuse of some buildings. I don't think we have a shortfall of tenant space on Love Lane, but Love Lane is one small block. I think over the winter months and into the spring, there was a lot of discussion about the vacancies in Greenport, which is a different story. But even there, I would wonder, because I think the market dictates what the values are. And at some point, I would hope that a landlord with a vacancy would recognize maybe taking a long shot on that young person that does want to start a business. And I'm sure there are people out there that would like to start one.
Definitely. And we've talked about tourism and the tourism economy, but many residents worry about over-tourism and short-term rentals. Where do you stand on how the town should handle even short-term rentals?
The concept of a short-term rental, I think, by town standards, is pretty much well-defined. First of all, you need to have a rental permit. That's number one. And number two, you're limited to a 14-day stay. Now, if anyone opens up the more popular websites, I'll just mention two, Airbnb or VRBO, I think you'll find any number of at least 1,000 homes within your immediate search area where people are actually scofflaws, I think is the word, that they're not following the law. The law also announces that you're supposed to promote your rental ID number. As a real estate professional, I can lose my license if I'm involved in a wrong rental. Mm-hmm. With that said, I'm also not the one that's going to, turn people in. I think that there's a problem here. I think it boils down to code enforcement. I'm not quite sure how or why code enforcement isn't chasing after these people. A lot of residents are upset about who's in the house next door to them or across the street from them. They don't like the concept of partying. They want to know their neighbors. That's one of the special things about Southold. Historically, you knew your neighbors. Yes. I always found it amazing that walking in and out of shops, people held a door for you. They'd smile. They'd say hello. You don't find that in more urban environments, and you don't find that in every town. But Southolders are truly special people, and we're, for the most part, rooted in our community, all want to contribute to our community, and we know one another. So I do think that the idea of a short-term stay that's not code compliant does create a little anxiety for a lot of people. Honestly, I think that that's something that needs to be discussed. I think at the town board level, the law needs to be very clear to make it possible for code enforcement to actually do their job.
Yes, definitely. It's definitely a challenge. And also, it tends to be more in the summertime and getting into fall pumpkin season. What are your thoughts on public transportation or just the traffic issues at certain times of the year?
So I think we've all felt that stress that you can't make a left turn at some point.
Yes.
Fortunately, our season historically was more after 4th of July than, like the Hamptons, everything started in, Memorial Day weekend. Mm-hmm. Tourism, as I said, is here. It's something that, whether we like it or not, is part of the town of Southold. Most people with an agribusiness do not cater just to the locals that live in town, although we all love to shop at area farm stands. We each have our favorite corn, whose is sweeter than the next or just right. That conversation and with traffic is a bit of a problem. It's easy when you look at things sort of in a rose-colored world or maybe in that vacuum where there is a perfect solution. But I think it's very hard. We're, first of all, on an island. Secondly, we're on a peninsula at the eastern end of that island. We're surrounded by water on three sides. So we have huge limitations. Fortunately, we have 3 parallel roads. Most traffic is contained to Main Road or the North Road. But, there's always been discussions of some sort of like a Greenport scoot or something. The train line seems to be underutilized.
Yes.
The S92 bus line really seems to be underutilized. At one point, I had a car breakdown probably like 20 or 25 years ago, and I was without a car, and it was a little bit of an issue trying to get around, and I'd rely on a taxi or I'd take my bike. And, just scheduling is always a problem. If you read the schedule, we have 2 trains east-west a day. So, you have 4 opportunities to sort of publicly move. Obviously, the S92 bus runs more frequently, but it's still not really at that schedule. So, that's something that I think would be wonderful if we could look into the opportunity. I always thought how wonderful it would be to take, whether it's an old school bus or even a mini school bus, and just to have 2 of them running in counter routes. So you have one leaving Mattituck heading towards Orient and another one leaving Orient heading towards Mattituck, which would afford people the opportunity and hopefully inexpensively to get around. As a tourist myself, I was recently in Delray Beach, Florida. It's a downtown, much larger obviously than Greenport, but to fund sort of public transportation, they have these large, like oversized mule golf carts that have billboards on them for local advertisers, which fund the actual use. And then they have, retirees or other people that want to volunteer their time driving people around. Mm-hmm. I think that one has to be creative. Traffic is a huge problem. I personally love in Europe how easy public transportation is. We don't necessarily have that in the United States, and I don't think it's something that we as a town board can actually either achieve, but maybe there are opportunities that somebody can start a small bus line or other means to help alleviate that traffic.
Yes, no, definitely. It's a challenge, and like you said, I think the train is underutilized and
hugely underutilized.
We don't get the support.
I walk every night in Peconic Lane at the Gene Cochran Park, and usually I time it so that I can walk either just before or after the train passes. So I oftentimes see the train passing. And in the evening, of course, the interior cabin is lit up. You don't see anyone in the train, whether it's going east or west. And I can't even imagine what the expense of running that service is for the Long Island Railroad. So perhaps there's ways that we could work with them to make something more efficient that would help people move around. But you have to remember, I think we live in an auto-dependent society. And
Yes,
that's a bit of the problem, too.
People are so used to that.
And your independence.
Yes, yes. And also just now, you've been on different boards, but just looking towards the town board, how would you work with a wide range of viewpoints when it comes to bridging political divide? And I'm not to say that on the town level it's nothing compared to what's on the national or state level. I think it's more divided than on the town level. But
so I think, first of all, I believe over the last 25 plus years, I've established a positive working relationship with everyone I know in this community. In town government, I know and respect all these people. They're colleagues. If and when I'm elected, I do think that I bring, based on my unique experiences, based on my upbringing, things I've seen, I bring something to the table that a different person might not have that same view. I'm very much open-minded to listening to people, to hearing things, to building consensus and finding commonality. And I think ultimately the biggest commonality is that we're all Southolders. I believe regardless of party, we want the same things. You mentioned water quality, the environment, transportation, tourism. I think earlier this year, I was completely shocked when the proposed code update was publicly released that there were a variety of uses that were announced to be permitted uses, which are currently not part of our town code, that actually took the time to write a letter to the editor of the Suffolk Times about. And I think that everyone in town government, everyone that lives in Southold, would tend to agree with me that those uses do not have a place in Southold. Yet they were presented. I think there's still going to be dialogue. Obviously, we're not at that point yet where the code has been adopted. But I really think that the commonality is the most important thing, that as Southolders, we need to talk these things through to try to understand them. You have to understand also the heritage that many families have within the community. And whether you're a first-generation Southolder or a seventh, you still have the same right to be spoken and heard and listened to. And as I said, I think building consensus is the number one task, at least for me, and I think I can bridge differences, that I'm willing to listen to people.
Yes, definitely. And if you're elected to office this fall, what's the first initiative you'd like to work on once you take office?
I think the zoning update is probably on the forefront of my mind. Housing would be number two. But I think the zoning discussion is probably the most important thing. It started, about 2 years ago, where pretty much, I don't want to say halfway through, but probably more than halfway through, there have been incredible sessions town-wide. There's a lot of loose ends. I think there's opportunities. I don't know if the town board is going to make it, sort of fast-track it to work on that before the end of the year. But I do think that if it's not resolved, or even if it is announced that we have a new code and voted on where it's legislation, there are things that I see in its present stage or status that I'd like to voice my opinions on more publicly and hopefully correct. But I do think if we have the right zoning in place, other things will fall in line, whether it's about tourism, whether it's about the housing conversation, etc. So I'd like to really work on the zoning changes that are coming our way.
Yes. And looking ahead, you've talked about zoning and housing being some of the top priorities, but what are your hopes for the future of the North Fork, or the future of the town of Southold and its community down the line? What would you hope to see?
I want to see preservation. I'm a big historian. One of the things I love most about Southold, and I sort of footnoted this earlier, is just that in my experience and my recollection, vistas, things that you'd see, being out on the water on my boat, sometimes you smell things that from a literal sense, reading different accounts of the first settlers, things that they, after being at sea for a month or whatever the time frame was that, in the 17th or 18th century when people traveled by sail ship to arrive in North America from Europe, fragrance of privet and bloom. I think that honestly, I want to preserve everything that we have today. I'd like to again see us embrace the changes that we need, but at the same time, we really need to preserve the Southold that we all know and love, because it is truly special. And at a time when so many things are being developed and altered and changed, it would be wonderful to see people preserving older homes, seeing adaptive reuse for existing barns so that you maintain the same vista, but have some sort of a functional use. Not everyone is growing hay or have livestock that they need to house in a barn. You've got all these wonderful structures throughout town that really should be preserved because it is our community's identity.
Yes. And I think you've touched on it already with what you enjoy, but just looking at your time from coming out here and up to today, what have you enjoyed most about living and working out here on the North Fork?
I think the people. I'm a people person. As I said at the start of our interview or discussion, I've never done a podcast before. I love getting to know you and discussing things with you right now. And I truly enjoy the people. I think for the most part, the Southolders that I know and love are all committed residents of the town. They only have the best in their minds and hearts to help the next generation, children, both in schooling, in hobbies, in the volunteerism, in preserving our community's history, in any number of things. And, they're just wonderful people. And I think that's testimony to the town of Southold. Historically, I think we were a very isolated community. You have to remember that 495 didn't always exist. Mm-hmm. The concept of Southold was, again, at the tip of an island. Mm-hmm. It was a water-based society. We have to preserve that maritime heritage, too.
Yes.
It's just such a special place. Unlike anywhere else I've been, I've had the good luck as a young student, as a child, traveling with my family, seeing all kinds of different places. And I have to honestly say, Southold is among the most unique and beautiful places. Yes. It's a wonderful community.
Definitely.
Because of the people, too.
Absolutely. And I think just lastly, I'd like to ask if you have anything else you'd like to say or discuss that we haven't touched on. We touched on quite a few different
You're wonderful to ask that. I don't want to sound like my mind just went blank. There's so many things that I wanted to talk about, or the order. There's just a lot sort of kicking around in my mind. The town itself is such a special place. I really can't say thank you enough. I have incredible respect for my colleagues, both in town hall, for my neighbors, people I know in town. And one way or another, I'm part of this town. I look forward to serving the people, and I'm going to give it 110%. I'm very excited. If not, I continue in the things that I do. And I think people do respect the fact that while I'm not born in Southold, I am a Southolder.
Yes. No, but I want to thank you so much for taking the time to come on today and share your story and to talk about the town of Southold and your continued involvement in the community. So I want to thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Chris, I can't say thank you so much. You made this a painless experience.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Well, I hope you enjoyed episode 176 with Nicholas Planamento. I want to thank you for listening to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, and we'll see you next time.